In this episode, we have with us Padma Viswanathan. Padma Viswanathan is a Canadian-American writer and translator. Her novels have been published in 8 countries and shortlisted for the PEN USA Prize, the Scotiabank Giller Prize, and others. She has published short fiction, essays, and translations in Granta, the Boston Review, Brick, and elsewhere. Full-length translations include São Bernardo by Brazilian novelist Graciliano Ramos and Where We Stand by Djamila Ribeiro. Her most recent novels, The Charterhouse of Padma, was published in 2024. She is a professor of creative writing at the University of Arkansas-Fayetteville, where she is founding director of the Arkansas International Writer at Risk Residency program. Her English language translation of On Earth as It Is Beneath by Ana Paula Maya was longlisted for the International Booker Prize 2026.
My favorite books as a child were Anne of Green Gables, a Canadian classic, from the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler, which is a wonderful children's novel set in New York about a young girl around 12 years old, I would guess, who runs away from home with her younger brother to live at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And this girl is full of plans. She really looks after the details. I love that. She invites her younger brother because he is a miser and he has hoarded all this money. And so she knows that he will have the money to support her plan. And I loved how she had worked out. Her name is Claudia, this girl. She wasn't really unhappy at home, but she wanted adventure, and that was something that really appealed to me. And she had worked out all the details of how they could live at the Met, at least for a time. And I was growing up in a suburb of Canada. It felt so barren culturally, and like there was no adventure anywhere. And I loved these heroines who either dared to have adventures or had big adventures in their minds. And Anne of Green Gables was like that, somebody who she had lived a huge adventure. She was an orphan. She had passed through a couple of foster homes, and then she was adopted by mistake by this older brother and sister who thought they were getting a boy to work on their farm, and instead they get this girl. And Anne is extremely fanciful. She is very forgetful because she's just always living in her dreams. And I was that kid who, my parents would come home from work before I came home from school, for example, and find out that I had left the door completely open, because I had just wandered out of the house thinking about something else. And so I appreciated that there were these heroines I could identify with who also agreed that it wasn't interesting whether you closed and locked the door. It was very interesting to live in some world of fancy. And my third most favorite book was Harriet the Spy by Louise Fitzhugh. And again, another New York novel about a misfit kid who lives really through her observations. She has these roots. She fancies herself a spy and she takes notes. And these are extremely popular books. I don't think I was alone at all in loving them, except in my context. I didn't know other kids who loved these books. And since I've grown up, I've read those books to my own children. And I understand they have huge, massive worldwide followings. They're very popular. But in my childhood, they were those books were some of my best friends.
So how did you get into writing?
I took a very circuitous route. I had no idea I wanted to be a writer. I went to university very young, at the age of 16, and I just went to my local university and ended up majoring. I switched my concentration every year. I ended up with a sociology degree. I was still very discontent with this, and I started to have terrible mental health problems, actually, just not knowing what I wanted to do with my life. And I would work hard all the time. I was involved in so many different pursuits, but I started to think by the ripe old age of 21 that I would never know what I was meant to do with my life. By that point, I started to get into theater. And when I was about 25, I think, doing many interesting things, but still really not out of the woods in terms of my we could say self-esteem, and also mental stability. I was working for this theater company where, with a very supportive artistic director. She encouraged me to just try everything that they did. And they ran in the evenings a playwrights circle. So I joined the playwrights circle and I wrote a scene, a gentle satire of the communal house where I was just living at that time. And it sort of satirized, it was about an Indian graduate student who came to live in this house because he was taking too long to finish his master's. And he had run out of his university housing. And so he had to look for a house off campus. And he came to this house with all these lefty Canadians who assumed he was very spiritual. And I thought it was very funny when I wrote it. But more importantly, when I wrote that scene, it came together in this kind of a magical moment for me. The scene came out 20 minutes, integral pacing was exactly as I wanted it. And I thought, okay, this is what I'm meant to do. I'm meant to be a writer. And then I had this enormous good luck because all of those little scenes were performed by professional actors. They read them in this cabaret at the end of our 8-week session, or whatever it was, 6 or 8 week session. And there was a new artistic director in town who had moved to Edmonton, where I was still living, to take over a local theater company. And he saw that 20-minute scene and he commissioned it for his company. He said, "I would like you to be our playwright in residence." Yeah, it was really Cinderella story. And so overnight, I went from not knowing I wanted to be a writer to just being a professional writer. And he mentored me and guided that play through 2 years of development. And he ended up producing it. And so I sort of realized I wanted to be a writer and professionalized in exactly the same moment. He's still, a very close friend, and he's been my mentor for 30 years, however long it's been.
Yeah, you've been very successful as a writer, and in 2024, your novel came out. That is the Charterhouse of Padma, right? The recent one. What is this about, the Charterhouse of Padma? Because I was curious, because I was intrigued because your name is involved.
It's true. I mean, it's a play on the Stendhal novel, The Charterhouse of Parma, which it was at one time anyway, very famous, like a French classic that very few people read now. It's slightly dull, I admit. I have read it, but it's not necessarily to everybody's taste. My study, which actually you can see, Anil, right now, you can see my study is the color chartreuse. This is this color of lemony green, which is my favorite color. It's been my favorite color since I was a teenager. And so many people in my circles associate it with me. And chartreuse, the color, got its name from chartreuse, the liquor, which is produced by these monks in the monastery of Saint-Pierre de Chartreuse. This is the original Charterhouse. A Charterhouse is a Carthusian monastery. And so this is the etymology of that word, chartreuse, which is the name for my favorite color. Now, several years ago, when the pandemic fell, I was working on another novel, a novel that I'm working on right now, but it's a novel that takes place in many locations around the world. And I just found I couldn't write it. It sort of ground to a halt because I couldn't leave my house. And not only could I not leave my house, I was very intensely interested in this moment in human culture when none of us were meant to leave our places. I mean, it happened in different moments in different countries, and it really manifested differently in different countries depending on local conditions. But I became very interested in the effects of the pandemic on human society, especially in relation to a Bruce Chatwin novel called The Songlines. So Bruce Chatwin was a British novelist who died in the 80s. And he wrote this book called The Songlines, set in Australia, about what he terms the human urge to move. And this is a book in which there's sort of a novelistic fictional part. And then the second half, the fiction, the story gives way to a series of thoughts, pensées, based on Blaise Pascal's notion of just like a book of thoughts. So it's sort of loosely essayistic, but nonfiction effectively, meditations on the human urge to move. And I became very inspired by this formally. And I started wondering about writing a book about what happens when that, like, is that a fundamental human urge, and what happens when it's thwarted? And so the book itself, ultimately, I wrote it in 6 months. It starts out focused on a South Asian Canadian woman who we know only by her initial P. She's living in Fayetteville, Arkansas. She's a translator.
Oh.
And she's married to a guy called Mac. Who teaches at the business school and architecture school. Yeah, you can see there's some similarities to me. They have 2 kids. She's married to a white man. But then the pandemic falls and she finds out a very bad secret about her husband. And then that narrative closes and it opens on another South Asian Canadian woman who lives in Fayetteville, Arkansas, who teaches at the University of Arkansas, who is a novelist.
Okay.
Also married to a white guy, married to a translator. Mm-hmm. And his name is Matt.
Okay.
Not Mac, but Matt. And in that case, in the first case, this woman thinks she has a happy marriage, and then it founders during the pandemic because of confinement. In the second case, this woman is actually unhappy. She thinks her husband is a very good man, but she's kind of fighting the strictures of marriage. And in the sort of blanketed hush of the pandemic, they find each other again. The marriage heals in the pandemic. And so we have their 2 kind of mirror stories. But each woman is writing an essay about the color chartreuse.
Oh, nice. Very interesting. Sounds very interesting. I had to pick it up and read now.
It's not to everybody's taste, but it's done a lot better than I expected. I never thought anybody would want to read this book. It was just something fun to do during the pandemic. I was teaching online. We were very lucky. We have our jobs. We were able to switch to online, and all of our living parents, my parents and my husband's mother, they were all living with us, and the children. So we had all 7 of us under one roof. Everybody was safe. And so I wrote this, this novel that was a bit of an indulgence. But yeah, anyway, that's what it is.
Okay. Now, how did the translation happen, Padma?
I became intensely interested in Brazil when I was in my late 20s through just a funny series of connections. I was working on my first novel, which is set in São Bernardo, and I was researching syncretic religions. That is to say, what happens when one culture encounters another, especially a dominant culture with a less dominant one, how religious expression changes. Mm-hmm. And so, many people will suggest that in São Bernardo in particular, for example, if you believe in certain historical notions of sort of Aryan arrival and the arrival of Proto-Hinduism, then you might suggest that, like the Hindu pantheon, the way that it overlays or is associated with village goddesses, the various like Ammans. This is an example of sort of syncretic fusion. And so I became fascinated with this. And in Brazil and in many places where West Africans were enslaved and brought there and not permitted to practice their own religions, you find very interesting fusions and overlays of Catholicism on West African cosmologies. Yeah. Okay. And so I became very interested in this, and especially in Brazil, because right then, I want to say this was around 92, David Byrne founded the record label Luaka Bop and released the first album, which was of Brazilian popular music. And this was another just watershed moment for me. When I heard that music, I felt like, wow, this is the music I've been waiting for my whole life. And I became intensely interested specifically in Brazil. People will want to talk to me about Latin America. I don't really know a lot about Latin America in general, but I became fascinated with this one country. And I was also involved at that time in the Amnesty International Artists Network. And there was somebody in Amnesty who had suffered under the Argentinian dictatorship. They were Argentinian, and they wanted to ask me as a playwright about writing a play about human rights issues in the region. And I was at that time, I was doing kind of more social issue theater. I went away from that, but all of this came together to get me to go to Brazil and start doing some research toward a possible writing project. This led to journalism concerning Brazil. And so I was writing about Brazil in a more casual way for a while. The play never really materialized. That's where I was when I met an American who I ended up marrying. I came to the US, I came to this little college town, and I didn't have anybody to speak Portuguese with. And, and I had been living in Montreal. I would go out every Sunday night to hear Brazilian music. And one of my best friends, who was my Portuguese teacher, was also Brazilian. And so I had a lot of interaction. Here, I didn't have that. I had also, meantime, started to do a tiny bit of translation. I had done a couple of graduate degrees in order, I came to the US to be close to him. And so when I hit that point of feeling very lonely for Brazil, my husband said, "Why don't you consider translating a book?" And I found the modernist classic that became my first book-length project is one of several books by that writer, Graciliano Ramos, who I believed needed new translations. That the particular book that I ended up translating, it does have quite a competent translation from the 70s. It's just really outdated, and I felt it didn't represent the real verve and potential of that book and didn't have the visibility it deserved. Graciliano Ramos is incredibly influential in Brazil. His final novel, Vidas Secas, is taught in every school in Brazil. Everybody would have opinions on which of his books is the best if you would talk to any educated Brazilian. And yet here, nobody had read him. And I felt it was so tragic, and this is how many translation projects start, is you have this book and you really want your reader friends to be able to read it. And, but I wanted them to be able to see it the way I saw it. And so I translated it kind of for people like that to be able to have access to it. Yeah.
So far, how many novels you have translated? About 6?
No, only 4 books. Only 3 of them are published. A number of short pieces. Yeah. I've translated 2 books by Ana Paula Maya, but the second one is only coming out this fall.
That is part of this trilogy, other than the Of Cattle and Men and this one, and there is one more I heard.
Correct. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, it's called Bury Your Dead.
Oh, we'll come to that later. Okay. Now, being a writer, and you're a translator and you're a writer, how do you think translating from Portuguese to English helps you as a writer?
I mean, it's a form of writing, translating, of course. Sometimes it can feel in my own writing that a certain scene or passage, sometimes a story, has just a shape that I am simply trying to render on the page. And translation, of course, can have a similar feeling. You can see it in a sense in the source text, but to try to get it down in English is a very similar channel that I employ. And that's why I don't, unlike some people who write in the morning and translate in the afternoon or go back and forth between projects, I tend to be a daily writer, and I tend to use that same slot, sort of 7 to 1, 7 a.m. to 1 p.m. for translation, as opposed to writing when I'm translating a piece. So it's that same energy, the same awakening of expression that I use for both of them.
Could you please come again?
I said it's the same kind of, I don't know exactly what I said, actually, that same awakening of expression, I think is what I said. Yes. And so
I wanted you to reiterate that. That's the reason I asked.
I mean, yeah, there is, I hadn't put it that way before, but from the moment I decided I wanted to write, I realized I was going to be a daily writer, and I was going to get up in the morning, and it was going to be the first thing that I would try to be available to. And I do this also with the books I translate. From the time I became a writer, I wanted to be able to write in many voices. And as a playwright, I was able to have the chance to enact that, right, with writing dialogue for many different characters. And so I think of translation as another exercise in that, writing not only in different characters' voices, but actually in other writers' voices, which is a huge privilege. It's more frightening. Writing in the different voices of characters that I have invented, it feels like a bigger responsibility, but it is a challenge it's a challenge I very much enjoy. Yeah.
One of my favorite themes when I read any novel, the exploration of violence, the kind of violence that we humans inflict on others mentally or physically. That is one of my favorite themes. So one of the best novels I read, in fact, it happened at the same time. I was reading Tamil writer Jamon's The Abyss. It's a wonderful novel, translated by Suchitra Ramchandran. And again, there was a review somewhere, and I just picked up Of Cattle and Men, again Anna Palmayas. Oh, I loved the novel. Actually, it's a very short novella kind of a thing. I think it's the same size, I guess, like the recent one. So, how did you come across Anna's writing?
It was Charco, the publisher, who reached out to me.
Oh,
yeah. I had spent a year in the UK. The year after my first translation came out. So Charco Press was aware of me because of that translation and because of Daniel Hahn, who has done a lot of work for them. He's an extremely prolific translator and somebody who was becoming a friend already and has become a very good friend since, in part because Danny and I are co-editing the Penguin book of Brazilian short stories together. And so for the last couple of years, we've been working together very, very closely on...
That has come out?
No, it's coming out in November of this year. And so somehow Charco knew of me and they asked me, they needed a translator for this new one for On Earth as It Is Beneath, and asked me if I would consider doing this one and Bury Your Dead. So that's how I first came to her work. Truthfully, I hadn't known her before Charco introduced me to her work. So this is another huge benefit of being a translator, is that you get led to writers you might not otherwise have. I probably would have ended up reading her. I did, of course, read Zoe Perry's wonderful translation of the first book of Cattle and Men, but I wouldn't have gotten to know her as intimately as I have.
No, they're a wonderful publisher, Charco Press. I think they publish exclusively Latin American literature, I guess.
Correct, yeah.
From Portuguese and Spanish. I read many of their titles, I think at least 6 or 7 of them. Because Danny Han and all these big translators of Spanish and Portuguese, they publish them. And other one who is long listed along with you, one of my favorite translators, Robin Myers. She also has done a lot of titles, a lot of translations for them. I think 7 or 8 translations, if I'm not wrong. Now, Anna Palmaya, often even I felt so. I have not read the Cormac McCarthy many novels. I read a couple of them. And I found some similarities as far as the thematical construction is concerned. So, how do you compare and contrast these two writings?
Yeah, as I mentioned to you in one of our email exchanges, Ana Paula does get compared to Cormac McCarthy, I think, often for the landscapes that her characters are moving through, this feeling that violence is not only inevitable, it's almost provoked by these physical circumstances that these men are in. And I mean, I will say that in the narrative prose, the descriptive prose, McCarthy, well, maybe I'm going to contradict myself. I was going to say that McCarthy is quite biblical. He has this high rhetorical tone. Ana Paula is quite dry by comparison and mostly fairly terse, except for these moments when the prose just seems to lift off into this. Often when it's engaging the landscape, it will then lift off into this sort of lyrical flights. So I do find I would never render Ana Paula's descriptive prose in a way inspired by McCarthy, except if you think about McCarthy's long dialogues in The Road and in some of those books where there are dialogues between people who don't know each other well, and where business has to be transacted. For example, I'm thinking about, I'm contrasting this with his Border trilogy, which are about, young men. It's a very different thing from some of his more brutal novels. But in the more brutal novels, you will have these exchanges, and often the individuals are not brutal at all. Many of Cormac McCarthy's characters are really quite tender, but they're people who must engage in these transactions. They're people who must get a job done, and they are often quite terse and funny. Ana Paula as well. It doesn't get talked about that much, but often she does have this sly humor that she rings from that very terseness and so on. Yeah, and so it was very important to me that I got those beats. That if it was clearly there are these like little nods, it's funny. A character himself is observing without saying it that his situation is kind of funny, and so I always want to make sure that they get that, because for me humor is part of grace, and she gives her characters a lot of grace. Yeah.
Now, would you please introduce the novel to our listeners?
Sure. So Ana Paula Maya's On Earth as It Is Beneath is the story of, I would say it's the story of two men in particular. Edgar, who is a cook, and Branco Gil, who is, I don't know what we call him, a sort of a jack of all trades, a hunter, both of whom find themselves among the last prisoners in a penal colony that was established for reasons I don't really want to reveal to your listeners. I want them to read the book and find out. But what they will learn quite quickly is that the director of this penal colony has gone off the edge. And he is playing a very dangerous and inhumane game, of which the prisoners are the targets and the victims. So that's how I would introduce this novel.
I find it very interesting, from Off Cattle and Men. And at the end of this novel, this On Earth as It Is Beneath, the one character comes from that novel into this novel, Milo.
You're going to find that happens again in the next novel, in Bury Your Dead. It's an equally elliptical and it's not a direct connection, but there are references to what happens to Branco Gil outside of the stories that we get from him.
Now, you mentioned about the upcoming Living Tamil Literary Festival. Would you please give more details about this festival?
The thing I'm most excited about right now is in April in New York, in about 2.5 weeks in New York, initiated by Jayammohan. Jayammohan is one of the most popular contemporary Tamil literary writers, Tamil language. He's been translated, I think, by a couple of different people, and he has become, from what I understand, and maybe you can enlarge on this, Anil, he's also become quite a public literary figure.
Yes.
And so in April 3rd and 4th in New York City, we're going to be enjoying the first, what's being called the Living Tamil Lit Fest. A festival of contemporary Tamil literature and translation. I'm going with my husband, actually. We've both been invited to participate as translators and as writers. My husband is a poet who translates from Italian. They have invited a number of contemporary, a number of our friends. We were surprised to see our translator friends from in and around the New York area are going to be participating, along with a number of Tamil language writers from around the globe. So, So I just have to say I'm very excited about that. I'm now seeing Danny Hahn, together with our other friend Jason Grunebaum, started the South Asian Literature and Translation Initiative. And I think this has been another part of what feels to me like an extremely exciting development, which is just seeing a lot more South Asian literature in South Asian languages being presented to the world.
Now, to wrap up, would you read a small portion from the novel?
Yes, of course, I'll be happy to.
On Earth as It Is Beneath.
It works well with just the first long paragraph. Should we do that? It's about 2/3 of a page. Okay.
Yeah, please.
Pouco havia restado, fossem homens ou animais. Enxadas e foices permanecem largadas nos cantos das plantações ressequidas pela falta de chuva. Córrego estreito e mal cheiroso fornece água, porém mingua visivelmente dia após dia, sugado pelo calor intenso que o evapora e deixa o ar úmido e pesado. Ainda há movimentação no galinheiro e alguns grunhidos na pocilga, e que garante carne na panela para os próximos dias. No mais, a escassez preocupa. Aguardam uma ordem, comboio que virá buscá-los e levá-los a outra parte. Mas a consternação aumenta desde que a comunicação com o lado de fora dos muros silenciou. As linhas telefônicas estão interrompidas há dias. E a última notícia que tiveram é que um oficial há de chegar ao local para uma inspeção final e os conduzirá ao destino seguinte. De acordo com os cálculos, o oficial está atrasado em pelo menos 7 dias, e isso aumenta vertiginosamente o sentimento de angústia. Tudo o que fazem é aguardar. Little is left, men or animals. Hoes and sickles lie where they were dropped, in the corners of fields, dried up for lack of rain. A narrow, stinking creek provides water, but it dwindles visibly day by day, sucked dry by the fierce heat evaporating it, making the air humid and heavy. There's still movement in the chicken coop and occasional grunts from the pig pen, guaranteeing meat in the pot for the next few days. Beyond that, the scarcity is worrying. They're awaiting orders, a convoy to come take them somewhere else. But consternation's been growing since they lost contact with the outside. The phone lines have been down for days, but last they heard, an official was coming out to do a final inspection and drive them to their next stop. According to their calculations, the official's at least 7 days late, causing a steep increase in anxiety. All they can do is wait.